The galaxy sent a distress signal then. Humanity's death world or fleet arrived. Part 1. The signal. Dale Garrett was not a man who got excited easily. He had spent 23 years sitting in front of monitoring screens, watching numbers scroll past, listening to static and drinking bad coffee. He had seen a lot of nothing. On most nights, nothing was exactly what happened. It was late. The station was quiet. The other two people on his shift had stepped out for a break, and Dale was alone with his screens and a cup of instant noodles that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The noodles were bad even when they were hot. He ate them anyway. Then his console beeped. It was not a normal beep. The monitoring station picked up signals all the time, background noise, old probe data, the usual chatter of a galaxy full of species talking to one another. But this sound was different. It was not one frequency. It was all of them. Someone had broadcast on every single channel at once, as loud as they could, in every direction. Dale put down his noodles and leaned forward. The signal was coming from the Veth colony cluster, 42 light-years away. The Veth were a quiet species. They were small, amphibious, and bioluminescent, meaning parts of their bodies glowed with soft light, the way some deep-sea creatures on Earth did. They had been members of the Galactic Accord for 400 years. They had never caused trouble. They had never asked for anything. Until now. Dale's translation program worked fast. It took the alien signal and turned it into human words, and the words were very simple. They said, "The Keth have broken the Accord. Our colony worlds are burning. We have no fleet left to defend ourselves. We are asking anyone who can hear this, please help us." Dale sat very still for a moment. He read the message again. Then he opened a channel to Earth Command and read it to them. There was a pause on the other end. Then the duty officer said, "Stand by." Dale stood by. He looked at his screen. He looked at the star map, at the small cluster of dots that marked the Veth colonies, and at the larger cluster nearby that marked Keth space. The Keth were not a species anyone in the galaxy liked very much. They were big, aggressive, and had spent the last several decades making noise about territories that did not belong to them. 3 years ago they had walked out of the Accord's Arbitration Council, the body meant to settle disputes peacefully. Nobody had done anything about it at the time. It looked like that had been a mistake. While Dale was waiting, the Galactic Accord called an emergency session. It was the fastest the Accord had ever assembled. Within hours, delegates from 39 of the 47 member species were present. They sat in the great circular chamber on the Accord's neutral station and looked at one another with various expressions that, across all their different faces, meant roughly the same thing: "This is very bad." The Veth ambassador was there. Her name was Luravas, and she was young. For a diplomat, barely 80 years old. Which for a species was something like being in your 30s. She sat very still and watched the other delegates talk. Her body gave off a faint, dim light. Those who knew the Veth well enough could read mood from the color of that light. Hers right now was very dark. The delegate from the Serendi spoke first. The Serendi were beings made of gas and light, ancient and calm, and they had not been involved in a war for longer than humans had been building cities. Their delegate said, the Accords Charter does not require military action. The Charter requires diplomacy. Channels must be opened. The Caith must be contacted. Negotiations must happen. Several other delegates agreed. There were procedures, they said. There were rules. You could not simply send warships into another species' claimed territory without going through the proper steps. First, Lier Avas listened to all of this. She did not argue. She had already seen the camera feeds from the first colony, the one the Caith had hit in the opening hours of their attack. There was not much left of it. Arguing about procedure felt very far away from what she had seen on that screen. In the back of the chamber, seated in a modest chair at a modest desk, was the human delegate. Her name was Caroline Adler. She was a small woman with short gray hair and the kind of face that did not show much. She had been quiet through most of the session. She took notes. She listened. At some point during the debate, she quietly opened a secure channel on her personal communicator and sent 2 words to Earth Command. The words were, authorized deployment. She closed the channel and went back to taking notes. Earth Command's response came 6 minutes later. It did not say yes or no. It said, already moving. Back at the monitoring station, Dale Garrett was still at his desk when a second message came in on a private military frequency. It was brief. It told him that the Terran Expeditionary Fleet had begun transit 40 minutes ago, before the Accord session had even started, before the vote, before anyone had officially decided anything. Dale sat back in his chair. He looked at the cold noodles. He thought about that for a while. The Accord session went on for another 3 hours. They debated procedure and charter, language and the proper forms of diplomatic contact. Some delegates expressed concern about escalation. One delegate suggested forming a committee to study the situation and report back within 30 days. Lyro Vass, the Veth ambassador, finally spoke near the end. Her voice was very quiet. She said, 30 days is a long time when your homes are burning. Nobody had a good answer for that. The session ended without a resolution. The Accord had not voted to act, but it had also not voted to stop anyone from acting. It was the kind of outcome that meant different things to different people. To the Serendi and the others who wanted caution, it meant wait. To Caroline Adler, who was already packing her bag to go to the transit hub, it meant the door is open. She sent one more message before she left. It went to Admiral Nora Ewan, who was already several light years into the journey aboard the TES Iron Patience. The message said, the Accord is watching. Make it mean something. Ewan read it. She forwarded it to no one. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her and looked at the star chart on the wall of her cabin, at the line that marked their course, at the small cluster of dots at the end of it. Then she went back to work. And 42 light years away, in what remained of a Veth colony that had once been home to 600,000 people, someone looked up at the sky and wondered if anyone had heard their signal. Someone had. They were already on their way. The galaxy sent a distress signal then. Humanity's Deathworlder fleet arrived. Part 2, the fleet. The ships came out of faster than light transit one by one, dropping back into normal space at the edge of the Veth. colony system like stones breaking the surface of still water. 14 cruisers, 26 escort ships, 9 troop carriers, and 3 vessels that none of the alien observers watching the feeds could put a name to. Wide, flat, heavily armored things that looked less like warships and more like something built to survive a catastrophe. They were not pretty ships. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Most spacefaring species, when they built warships, built things that were sleek or imposing, or at least visually impressive. Human ships looked like they had been designed by someone who did not care at all about appearances and cared very much about not dying. The hulls were thick. The armor plating was layered. Every exposed surface was either a weapon, a sensor array, or more armor. There were no smooth lines. There was nothing decorative. The ships looked like they had been made for one purpose and nothing else. Fleet Admiral Nora Ewan stood on the bridge of the TES Iron Patience and watched her fleet come together on the tactical display. She was 61 years old, shorter than most people expected an admiral to be, with close-cut silver hair and eyes that moved quickly and missed very little. She had not slept in 31 hours. She did not look like it bothered her. Behind her, 412 crew members were at their stations. Every one of them had volunteered for this mission. There had been more volunteers than there were spaces. Ewan had read the numbers and felt something she did not have a word for. She had chosen carefully, taking the best she could find, and the people she chose had dropped what they were doing and been aboard within 18 hours of the call going out. That was humans, she thought. That was just what they did. Lieutenant Owen Park was 26 years old and had been in the fleet for 4 years. He was not particularly large or particularly loud. He had a calm face and careful hands, and he was very good at his job, which was targeting systems. He sat at his station on the IES Caldwell Ridge, one of the escort cruisers, and brought the Cathar fleet into focus on his screens. He counted. He counted again. He ran the numbers through the computer to make sure he had not made a mistake. He turned to his commanding officer. Captain Laura Ben was standing behind him, looking at the same screen. She was 40 years old, tall, with dark hair pulled back in a scar along her left jawline from an accident in training years ago. Owen said, "We are outnumbered about 3 to 1, ma'am." Ben looked at the screen for a moment. She said, "Good. They won't have room to maneuver." Owen looked at her. He was not sure if that was a joke. She did not look like she was joking. He turned back to his station and began preparing targeting solutions. The Caith fleet was large. It had to be large. The Caith were a species that believed in overwhelming force as a strategy. Why use a small force when a large one would guarantee victory? Their ships were powerful, built for long-range combat, designed to stand off at a distance and pound targets into rubble. They had done exactly that for the last 6 days to the Veith colony worlds below. They had not expected anyone to show up. When the human fleet appeared on their sensors, the Caith commander, whose name translated roughly as First Strike of the Morning, unanswered, reviewed the numbers. 52 ships. He had 160. He had longer-range weapons, heavier individual ships, and 6 days of momentum. He was not worried. He did not know what the 3 flat, wide ships were. His intelligence files had nothing on them. He flagged it for review and moved on. Admiral Ewan opened a channel to the VTH civilian transport that was still sitting in the system, the one that had refused to evacuate. Ambassador Liera Voss appeared on screen. She looked exhausted. Her bioluminescence was low and unsteady. Ewan told her how many ships had come. There was a silence. It lasted long enough that Ewan thought the channel had dropped. Then Larava said, slowly and halting, "Human standard, you came so fast." Yuan said, "We were already moving before the vote was finished." Another silence. Then Larava's asked, "Why?" Her voice was not angry or suspicious. She sounded genuinely confused, the way someone sounds when they encounter something they have no framework for. She said, "Your species and mine have barely spoken in 60 years. You do not owe us anything. Why did you come?" Yuan thought about that for a moment. It was not a complicated answer. She said someone needed help. That is enough. She closed the channel before the ambassador could respond. She turned to her tactical officer. She said, "Get me firing solutions on the lead Kaith cruisers. All 3 of them." Her tactical officer, a young man named Eli Cross, had his hands already moving. He said, "Ready when you are, Admiral." Yuan looked at the screen. She looked at the Kaith fleet, 160 ships, confident, spread out in a formation, designed for long-range bombardment, not for close combat. She looked at her own fleet, 52 ships, thick-hulled, crewed by people who had come across 42 light years because someone had asked for help. She said, "All ships, this is Yuan. We are going in close, not regulation distance, close enough that they cannot use their long guns without hitting each other. Follow my lead and do not stop moving." The bridge was quiet for a moment. Then Eli Cross said, very calmly, "Understood, Admiral." Across the fleet in 52 ships, 4,000 men and women heard the same order and said the same thing. The Kaith commander saw the human ships begin to move and frowned, an expression that on his species involved the flattening of the large ridge above his eyes. They were not moving away. They were moving toward him. All of them. Vast. He checked his screens. He checked them again. He said to no one in particular, "What are they doing?" Nobody in his fleet had a good answer. The human ships kept coming. The galaxy sent a distress signal, then humanity's Deathworlder, our fleet arrived. Part 3, the Battle of Veth Prime. The first shot was fired by Owen Park. He had a targeting solution on the lead Keth command cruiser, a ship 4 times the size of the Caldwell Ridge, carrying enough firepower to level a city from orbit. He had the solution locked for 40 seconds before Captain Ben gave the order. When the order came, his hands were steady. He pressed the firing control without hesitation. The round that left the Caldwell Ridge was called a kinetic penetrator. It was not a beam of energy or an explosive. It was a solid object made of very dense material accelerated to a speed that most species considered physically irresponsible to put inside a weapon. It was wrapped in a shaped field of plasma to help it cut through shielding. It had no guidance system. It did not need one. Owen had already done the math. It crossed the distance between the 2 ships in less than a second. The Keth command cruiser did not explode. Explosions were dramatic but messy. What happened to the cruiser was more precise. The round entered at the forward section, traveled through the length of the ship, and exited from the rear, taking with it a large portion of the vessel's internal structure. The ship did not break apart immediately. It just stopped. All of its systems went dark at once. It drifted. Owen looked at his screen. He said, "Target neutralized." Moving to secondary. Across the fleet, the other ships were doing the same thing. But the weapons were only part of what made the next 9 hours unusual. The bigger surprise was how close the human ships got. Admiral Ewan had split her fleet into 3 groups. 2 of them drove directly into the Caith formation, not at a safe combat distance, not at the range where the longer Caith guns were designed to operate, but into the middle of the enemy fleet, close enough that some of the Caith ships could not fire without risking hitting their own vessels, close enough that the big, slow Caith cruisers had trouble turning to track targets. This was not a strategy that any species in the Accord used. It was not in any tactical manual the Caith had studied. Most militaries avoided close combat in space for good reasons: the risk of collision, the difficulty of maneuvering, the way that proximity turned a controlled fight into something much harder to control. The human ships did not seem to mind the chaos. In fact, they seemed to move better. Captain Ben on the Caldwell Ridge was the first to make physical contact with an enemy vessel. A Caith heavy cruiser came alongside, trying to get an angle on one of the human transports. Ben did not move the Caldwell Ridge out of the way. She moved it closer. She brought her ship alongside the Caith cruiser until the 2 hulls were less than 50 m apart, then locked on with magnetic anchors, heavy clamps designed for exactly this purpose, and held. The Caith cruiser could not fire on the ships behind it without pointing its guns directly at the vessel it was now physically connected to. Ben said over the shipwide channel, "Boarding party, you are go." 38 soldiers moved through the Caldwell Ridge's forward airlocks. They carried cutting equipment, hand weapons, and the kind of focused calm that comes from training very hard for something you hope you never have to do. They cut through the Caith hull in 11 minutes. What happened on the other side of that hull took 22 more minutes. The Caith inside were not small. They were heavy gravity predators, evolved on a world with much stronger gravity than most inhabited planets, which meant they were built dense and powerful. On most other species, this would be a significant advantage in close combat. The problem was that many of the soldiers on the boarding party had also grown up on high-gravity worlds, human colony planets settled specifically because humans could adapt to them. These soldiers had bones and muscles built for conditions that would exhaust most beings in minutes. They were not faster than the Caith. They were not stronger, but they were close, and they did not stop, and they had prepared for exactly this kind of fight. The Caith cruiser was secured in 33 minutes total. It was the first time in the species' recorded history that one of their warships had been boarded. Across the system, similar scenes played out. Human ships took damage. One took a hit to its forward section. That killed 7 crew and left the captain running the ship from an emergency station at the rear. She did not break off. She found a new angle and kept fighting. Another ship lost its main engines and used its maneuvering thrusters to keep itself in the fight for another 2 hours, until a repair crew got the engines partially online. 3 ships were lost entirely. The Gallegos went first, hit by concentrated fire from 3 Keth cruisers at close range. Then the Henrietta Marsh, which had driven too deep into the Keth formation and been cut off. Then the Blue Alara, whose crew transmitted one last position report before their signal went dark. Their names were recorded. They would be added to the memorial in Geneva. That was the only thing that could be done for them now. 9 hours after the first shot, the Keth fleet broke. It did not happen dramatically. There was no moment of surrender, no signal, no formal end. The Keth ships simply began to move away from the battle, first the ones on the edges, then more and more of them, until what had been a formation became a retreat and then a scatter. They moved toward the edge of the system, toward the point where they could make the jump back to Keth space. Admiral Ewan watched them go. Her tactical officer, Eli Cross, asked her if they should pursue. She said no. Let them go. Cross said they'll report back. They'll tell the Keth command what happened here. Ewan said good. That is exactly what I want them to do. She turned away from the screen and looked at the system around her, the 2 colony worlds below, scarred from days of bombardment. The Veth civilian transport was still there, still in one piece. Lyra Avos had stayed through the entire battle. Ewan opened a channel. She said, Ambassador, the Keth fleet has withdrawn. We are beginning recovery operations. There was a pause. Then Lyra Avos said very quietly, how many did you lose? Ewan said 3 ships. All hands. Another pause, longer this time. Lyra Avos said, I am sorry. Ewan said, so are we. Now let's get your people some help. Owen Park had already left his station. His targeting systems were not needed anymore. He found his way to the troop carrier that was beginning its descent to the surface and asked the officer in charge if there was anything he could carry. There was always something to carry. He went down with the first wave. The Galaxy sent a distress signal. Then humanity's Deathworlder fleet arrived. Part 4, The Reckoning. 10 days after the battle, the Galactic Accord held its second emergency session of the month. The first had been about the Veth. This one was about humanity. The chamber was full. All 47 member species were represented, which had not happened in over a decade. Some delegates had traveled a very long way to be there. The Serendi, whose natural form was a slow-moving cloud of ionized gas, had arranged to project themselves into a containment field for the session, something they rarely bothered to do. The fact that they had bothered said something about how seriously they were taking this. The session was not hostile. That was important to understand. It was not a trial, and it was not a confrontation. It was more like the moment when a group of people who thought they understood the world realized that one piece of it was not what they had assumed, and they were all sitting together trying to figure out what to do about that. The Serendi delegate opened by presenting the engagement record from Veth Prime. Every ship movement, every weapon fired, every communication, everything. It had been compiled from sensors across the system and from the recordings of the Keth vessels that had survived. The delegate presented it without commentary in the same careful, ancient way that their species always communicated. Then they said, "We have reviewed this data." The Terran fleet engaged a force approximately 3 times its size. It sustained significant casualties. It achieved a decisive outcome in under 12 standard hours. We are uncertain how to classify this. Several other delegates spoke. A few used the word impressive. A few used the word concerning. One delegate from a species called the Mavari, whose home world had been involved in border conflicts with human colonies 40 years ago, used the word alarming. The delegate from the Pith, a species that had always been friendly with humanity, objected to alarming and suggested remarkable instead. There was a small argument about word choice that lasted longer than it should have. Then the delegate from the Riffian collective said what several of them were actually thinking. She said, "We need to understand whether humanity represents a threat." The chamber went quiet. Caroline Adler had been sitting at the human delegation's desk through all of this. She was a small woman, and she had a way of sitting very still, which some people found calming and others found unreadable. She had her notes in front of her, and she had been writing occasionally, but her expression had not changed. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up. She took a moment. Then she said, "We understand the concern. It is not unreasonable. We ask only that you consider the context alongside the capability." She paused. She said, "We were not sent to Veth Prime because humans are warlike. We were sent because someone asked for help and we had the ability to give it. The fleet did not go because Earth Command wanted to demonstrate anything. It went because Lyra Vast sent a signal that said please, and that word carries weight with us." Another pause. She said, "We would go again. For any of you. If the signal came from Serendi space, or Mavari space, or anywhere else in this accord, we would go. That is not a threat. It is a statement of who we are and what we think this body should mean. We hope the accord becomes what it says it is. We were willing to act as though it already was." She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then Lyra Vast stood up. She had been granted speaking privileges for the session, an unusual arrangement. But no one had objected. Her bioluminescence was bright today, brighter than any of the other delegates had seen it before. She was not a large being. She was small and soft-spoken, and her species was not known for military or political power. But she stood up straight and she spoke clearly. She said in Veth with translation running simultaneously, "I have lived my whole life among a people who have known peace. We thought we were safe. We thought the accord protected us. And then the Keth came and we learned that the accord's protection was a piece of paper and a committee that needed 30 days to form a study group." She paused. She said, "And then someone heard our signal. And they came. Not after a vote. Not after a study. Before the vote was finished, they were already moving. I do not fully understand humanity. In 80 years of diplomatic work, I have spoken more words to other Veth than to all humans combined. But I know what they did. And I think this accord would be wise to think carefully about what it means to call a friend a threat." She sat down. There was more debate after that. There always was. But the tone had shifted. The word alarming did not come up again. The proposal to formally assess human military capability was tabled, not rejected, just set aside for later, which in Accord terms often meant forever. What the Accord did agree on by the end of the session was a formal commendation for the crew of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet and a new working group on Accord rapid response protocols. It was a small thing, but it was a start. Meanwhile, a message arrived in Caroline Adler's office through a back channel, not through official diplomatic routes, not through the Accord's communication system, but through a private encoded relay that her office used for sensitive context. The message was in Keth military cipher. Her team decoded it within an hour. It contained one sentence. It said, "We did not know the humans would come." Adler read it twice. She sat with it for a while. Then she forwarded it to Admiral Ewan with a short note that said, "I think that is as close to an apology as we are going to get." Ewan's reply came back fast. It said, "Good enough. What do we do now?" Adler wrote back, "We rebuild what was broken. We offer to help do it. And we make sure the whole galaxy sees that that is what we chose to do." She sent the message and went back to work. The galaxy sent a distress signal. Then humanity's Deathworlder fleet arrived. Part 5: What Remains. 6 months after the battle, the colony worlds of the Veth were slowly coming back to life. It was not a fast process. The Keth bombardment had done serious damage, not just to buildings and roads and power systems, but to the deeper things that held a community together. People had lost family members. They had lost homes that had stood for generations. They had lost the feeling of safety, which is one of the hardest things to rebuild because you cannot see it or measure it. But the work was happening. Human engineering teams were on the ground alongside Veth architects, and together they were putting things back together piece by piece. It was slow work, partly because the two species had almost no shared methods. Humans built things one way, Veth built things another way, and neither way was wrong, they were just different. So there was a lot of standing around, pointing at things and drawing diagrams, and trying to understand each other. Nobody was in a hurry. The goal was not to finish fast. The goal was to do it right. Lieutenant Owen Park was still there. He had extended his tour once, and then a second time, and nobody at Fleet Command had given him a hard time about it. His official role was logistic support, making sure the right supplies got to the right places. In practice, this meant he spent a lot of his time carrying things, which was fine with him. He had always been more comfortable doing something with his hands than sitting at a desk. He had learned 17 words of Veth in 6 months. This was considered remarkable by the linguists who were studying the language, because Veth was not simply a spoken language. A large part of it was light-based. The bioluminescent patterns that Veth produced with their bodies carried meaning that sound alone could not convey. A human throat and vocal system could manage the spoken parts with effort, but the light component was simply impossible for a human body to produce. Owen had a solution for this. One of the engineers in his unit, a quiet woman named Patricia Cole, had built him a small handheld device that could produce the basic light patterns. It was not elegant. It looked like someone had taken apart a medical scanner and reassembled it without reading the instructions. But it worked mostly, and the vet who interacted with Owen found it more touching than funny, which was the right outcome. The vet medic he had helped on the first day was named Save, or rather the closest human approximation of her name was Save. The actual name involved a specific quality of blue-green light that Owen's device could produce, but that he still had trouble timing correctly. They had become friends. It had happened slowly and without either of them planning it. They shared meals when the biological requirements of their respective species allowed for it, which was more often than Owen had expected. The vet had a category of food that was essentially just vegetables and mild starches, and Owen could eat that without any problems. Save had tried human food twice. The second time had gone better than the first. She was endlessly curious about Earth. Owen had a tablet full of images, things he had taken himself and things he had downloaded before leaving. Mountains with snow on them. Forests so dense that no light reached the ground. Cities at night, seen from above, glittering like a circuit board. The ocean during a storm, waves higher than buildings. Save studied each image for a long time before moving to the next. She did not say much while she was looking. Her light patterns shifted slowly. Thoughtful colors, Owen had learned to recognize them by now. One evening, sitting outside in what remained of a park near the center of the colony's main settlement, the trees, they were growing back, slowly small and new. Save asked him why humans had come from such a dangerous world. Owen thought about it for a while before answering. He said, I think it made us what we are. Our world had things that wanted to eat us, and whether that could kill us, and gravity that made everything harder. We spent a very long time just trying not to die, and somewhere along the way we got used to not giving up, because giving up meant dying, and we did not want to die. Save glowed softly. Owen had been watching her light for 6 months, and he was starting to get good at reading it. That particular soft glow, that particular shade, it meant something close to understanding. Not agreement exactly. Just I see what you are saying, she said, and now you go to other places, other dangerous places, to help. He said, yes. She said, does it always cost you something? He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the Gallegos, the Henrietta Marsh, the Blue Elara. He thought about the families of everyone on those ships, the messages that had been sent, the ceremonies that had been held back on Earth while he was here carrying boxes. He said, yes. It always costs something. That does not mean we stop going. Save was quiet. Her light shifted again into something Owen did not have a word for yet. He was still learning. 3 weeks later, the Iron Patience and its fleet entered Earth's solar system on a Tuesday morning. It was early, before most people were at work. Dale Garrett was at his monitoring post. He was always at his monitoring post, eating a fresh cup of instant noodles, when the fleet's transponders appeared on his screen. He had good noodles today, the kind with the little dried vegetable pieces that actually tasted like something. He looked at the screen for a while. He thought about the night the signal had come in, the cold noodles, the quiet station, the moment when everything had become very different. Then he leaned forward and sent a short message to the welcome committee waiting at the receiving station. It said they're home. Go meet them. He leaned back in his chair and ate his noodles and felt, for the first time in months, something that was simply and straightforwardly good. On the VEF colony world, Owen Park and Save were sitting on a half-rebuilt wall at the edge of the settlement, watching the local sun go down. The sky here turned colors that did not quite exist on Earth. There was more red in it, and the clouds caught the light in a way that made them look almost solid. The skyline in front of them was a mix of old buildings that had survived and new ones going up, scaffolding and cranes, and the sounds of construction. It was becoming something again. Not what it had been. Something new. Owen did not say anything. Neither did Save. The light was very beautiful, and it was enough